Tom Ennis, and I actually have his bio up and ready to go this time. So
Awesome.
Tom is a professional engineer who spent a few decades working in the Chicagoland area on notable projects like the Deep Tunnel, Millennium Park, and the Waukegan Lakeshore Master Plan. He is the former vice president of Friends of the Fox River and a former officer of the Fox Valley branch of the APWA. He is a contributing author to Doug Farr's book Sustainable Urbanism and Sustainable Nation. Tom helped Austin, Texas pass the nation's first ban on coal tar sealants and has in his spare time assisted more than 100 communities, counties, and states on coal tar and high PAH product regulations. He has published several articles on this subject, many of which can be found on the website Coal Tar Free America. Tom?
Yes. And how's my screen looking there for you?
It looks good now.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about pavement sealant and the perils of pavement sealant. So getting a little closer to home. Thank you for the opportunity. This is, I want to dedicate this just before your last meeting. The two folks on the right here, that's Dr. Barbara Mahler and Dr. Pete Van Meter, were in a bad car accident, and Peter unfortunately died, and Barbara's been seriously injured and still not recovered. So much of the work we did in Austin was in collaboration with them, and much of the benefits around the nation have been as a result of their tireless work. So I'm hope to answer a few questions. Why did Austin pass a coal tar sealant ban back in 2005? Why did Home Depot and Lowe's stop selling this nationwide in 2007? Are you aware that the state of Illinois passed a coal tar sealant disclosure bill? If so, what does that mean for you or your communities? And did you know that about a third of the government members of your group already have passed a local coal tar ordinance? But we want to get back to the beginning. What are PAHs? If you don't know, these are carcinogenic, toxic, mutagenic. They're anytime you burn something. So for instance, since the dawn of time, anytime we burned things, cooked a meal, that's been a source of PAHs. Commonly today we have normal sources of being used motor oil, exhaust, industrial emissions, asphalt, coal tar, tires. The issue, if you're following like the crumb tire rubber issue with soccer fields, is one of those is PAHs in the ground up tires. PAHs, if you're not familiar, and I know in making this presentation that probably half of you are way up to speed, half of you may not know what we're talking about, but we'll just run through this quickly and as if you don't know all these things. The basis of a PAH is a benzene ring, six-sided benzene ring. And there are common ones we typically know: naphthalene, which is mothballs, anthracene, pyrene, and then when you put benzene and pyrene together, you get the most toxic, at least commonly known toxic PAH, benzo-A-pyrene. PAHs have a long history. They were the first isolated to cause cancer in chimney sweeps. And then we have if you read the histories, the World War I, the big concern about for Allies fighting Germany was the fact that the Germans knew how to extract amazing different uses out of coal tar than the rest of the world. And so the bears of the world that came from Germany were way ahead of the rest of the world, and the US and Western Europe had to catch up. It's a common pollutant from manufactured gas plants. If you're familiar with that, that's how people created light before electricity, and home heating gas before we had natural gas throughout the community. And so those manufactured gas facilities are throughout the United States, and they're sort of latent hazardous waste facilities. Typically, if you've got psoriasis, coal tar is used in dandruff shampoos and for treatment of psoriasis. And in the process of doing this, we learned that coal tar is used to induce cancer in laboratory animals. So why do they use it? Because it's effective and quick. It's well known that this is a bullhead catfish out of the Potomac River with lesions in its mouth, and it's presumably from PAHs, but any kind of thing that's going to be, the PAHs reside in sediments. So what are PAHs? They're going to be toxic. You guys know mutagenic means it causes mutations. Carcinogenic, causing cancer. Teratogenic, meaning it causes birth defects. So not a good thing. Generally, PAHs, we talk about the 16 primary PAHs, but actually there's hundreds, if not thousands, and we just particularly focus on benzoate-pyrene, and sometimes we even accumulate a benzoate-pyrene equivalency. EPA is classified as a persistent bioaccumulative toxin. Here's some values. I won't go through the whole list sometimes, and I'll make this presentation available through Ashley afterwards, but common exposures or concentrations. I put in the bottom there, if you see the third from the bottom bullet, the highest sediment value we in Austin ever encountered was 3,500 parts per million PAH. And for you folks, you've got, at least in your 2020 report, I saw the highest value being 210, and that's about 9 times higher than the probable effects concentration. They're mostly water, it's not as if you're spraying pure coal tar, pure asphalt. What you have is a pretty complex emulsion that is water or asphalt mixed with clay and a bunch of polymers and then sand, so it's not too slick, intended to beautify and extend the life of a pavement. This is how they spray it. They also can just broom it on or squeegee it on. And this is, if you see these telltale, across the middle of that screen is a caution tape. You see those around. And then maybe a cone showing where it's been freshly sealed, because you can't drive on it right away as it cures. Here's what you look on an aerial photograph. See the wear patterns where it's lighter colored? That's indicating that car traffic is actually wearing the sealant off. And so initially when we got involved, the city got involved in this, we said, well, where's it going? And then the industry said, well, it doesn't go anywhere, but we have to put it down every couple of years, which didn't make any sense. Nationwide, about 85 million gallons are used, and we're talking about something 1,000 times higher than the PEC. Here's what it looks on the ground when you walk across a parking lot that's been sealed and starting to wear off. And if maybe you'll begin to look at parking lots differently, like I do. But that's what you can see, the turning action and the forces of a tire actually wearing that seal coat off. That's actually the state EPA in Texas where we took that picture. This is before we understood that PAH is actually absorbed through the skin, we would just sort of swipe it up there with our finger and see what it looked like. And that's from 2005 when we didn't know any better. But that's kind of the material. Once it's leaving in a dust form, typically. It complements the slide I had previously, but the 3 large bullets there on the right, asphalt-based products have about 50 to 150 milligrams per kilogram, parts per million. Coal tar is 70,000, and this other thing, which you may not have heard of, is called ethylene cracked residue. That's what happens when you regulate one substance, industry comes up with a new one. We'll talk about a little bit more about that. But you can see it's coal tar light is what I would say. It's about a third less PAHs. And coal tar, where does it come from? It's a byproduct of making steel, because you use coke, the purified coal, to make steel. But unfortunately, or depending on how you look at it, most coal tar anymore in the United States is used up in the aluminum industry, and it's not really used for paving. So instead of having this leftover product that we need to get rid of, we're actually importing much of it. Now, the challenge with this is there's confusing terminology. So here's a bunch of different terms. Actually, when we started doing regulations, the industry said, no, it's actually refined tar, which technically it is, but it doesn't mean it's any less toxic. So the best way to know what you've got is look at the safety data sheet and look at the CAS number. If you're familiar with that, that's like a serial number for a chemical. And as you can see in the bottom circle there, it's a little small, but that the material is 10 to 30%. This particular coal tar product is 10 to 30% refined coal tar. And here's ethylene cracked residue, and this is a byproduct of making polyethylene or ethylene products. So hence it's an ethylene residue. And that even has more confusing nomenclature. Contractors, if you're going to have your driveway sealed and they say, oh, it's not coal tar, it's petroleum resin. What they mean is it's this ethylene cracked residue stuff, which is confusing, intentional or not. And then there's a whole bunch of other industry terms, which are, pyrolysis fuel oil, ethylene tar, petroleum resin. Doesn't sound like the same thing, but it is. And in the same way, you look at the safety data sheet, and it gives you clues to say, like this one in particular is 20 to 30% petroleum residue, steam cracked asphalt, or however you want to say it. But it's the same chemical abstract or CAS number. This is a graphic I put together that shows, it's a hyperlink PDF of all the different, or much of the different representative research, looking at the different avenues, because some research will look, well, let's just look at the products, or let's just look at volatilization of the product off the surface, or wear, or house dust, or runoff downstream, or stormwater control. So there's a lot of different research where people take a different avenue to look at. And we'll look at some of those. Before I do, I want to acknowledge my buddy from the city who figured all this out, Tom Bashira, back in 2003, when he first presented it, and we presented our data to USGS. They said, you better sample that again, because that's got to be an error, because we only see those values at hazardous waste facilities. And it wasn't an error, it was just unexpectedly high. One of the earliest studies was actually done by a chemist from Mobil Oil, studied coal tar pavement products out of a bucket, and he got one that was asphalt. So if you see number 11, that's asphalt based. But once you're above 1, you're a mutagen, and when you're above 500, you really can't get much more intense than that. So potent mutagenic product. And then we look around the country. USGS looked at upward trends. They did a 40 lakes study where they looked at trends in lakes sediment, and it's trending up. This is from 2005. And then this is some research we did at the city, washing off parking lots. Again, didn't know that we probably shouldn't have open-toed shoes, but again, it's kind of this weird world where you know what it is, but then you walk next door and kids are playing on a playground. So it's a strange thing when you know about its toxicity. Here are some early data that shows that first publication showed that runoff from coal tar sealants was 65 times higher than in PAHs than asphalt. And what does that mean? Well, the PEC, meaning the probable effects concentration, unsealed, had exceeded it, and sometimes that may be a drag-on effect from other tires and other parking lots, but otherwise you see Black River, Ohio, if you're familiar with that Superfund site, we are finding those levels higher than what would be at a Superfund site. So hence the concern about data integrity, but we ran enough tests to find that was not a problem. We then looked at, well, so what does it affect aquatic species? The answer is yes. We have endangered salamanders, and we had to get a special approval from U.S. Fish and Wildlife to actually study that, but it is a problem for them. And then we looked at effects on sediment biota, and that's a problem as well. So we not only find loss of high mortality depending on the concentration, but also we had loss of diversity of species. And this is a common phenomenon that's not frequently captured, is the fact that we have fish kills around the country when coal tar sealant is curing and it rains and it washes off to a nearby stream. If you're interested, you just Google or go on YouTube and look at Hodges Creek fish kill, and you can watch a really well documented video by the river keeper there as the spill was happening. The USGS did these additional studies, and the curiosity is, okay, it's highly potent early, okay, and then that's undiluted if you look at the orange bars, and that 48-hour exposure to runoff. But what's interesting is this next slide here. When you expose it to sunlight, you have nearly 100% mortality, even with a 10% dilution. So it's extremely potent. Then we looked at dust studies. They sampled dust around the country, and you can see a quite significant disparity between the east versus west. Coal tar sealants are typically used east of the Rockies, not exclusively, but oftentimes. And then we've got, well, if we got this dust and then we have our kids and our pets on there, what's the problem? And I'll mention here on my Coal Tar Free America website, I did a story after looking at this issue for 10 years about exposure to dogs to coal tar sealant. And that continues to be the most popular article, because I thought, if it's a problem for kids, who cares about dogs necessarily? Does it matter? And I guess it does. You guys know Lake in the Hills, just down the road. That was part of USGS's research, and they found that ended up being on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The contribution of sealants in there and increasing PAHs in their ponds there. As you guys know where Lake in the Hills is, but you see all this, everyone's seal coating their driveway, and you see those concentrations. A screening level is a 0.09 milligrams per kilogram, but also if you look at what's the EPA cleanup standard for a hazardous waste facility, it's 10 milligrams per kilogram, and a driveway with coal tar sealant 300 to 600 benzoate pyrene. It's incongruous. So typical, you just see that's every day, huh? It's a condo development or townhome development. So the question was, so this dust is coming off, what about humans? And then I helped the USGS work on a study looking at indoor dust. And you see initially, with no coal tar, you don't have a whole lot of dust inside the house, or PAHs inside the house or not. But outside you have dramatic levels, and then you have quite a bit higher dust PAH levels in the house dust. Well, is that a big deal or not? That's a good question. And then so we talked to a medical researcher out of Baylor that said, yes, that is a significant PAH dose, excuse me, pH dose for children. And compared to everything else, all the other PAHs they're exposed to. So house dust is a concern for anybody that's going to be on the floor a lot, which small children are. And it's interesting that they have gauges on how much dust does a kid eat in a given day and how much dirt. So it's a thing. This is another way of looking at that same sort of analysis that you can get a lifetime of exposure to PAHs just in the first 5 years of your life. And then the red bars there that show that if you're looking at the risk factors of Sealcoat dust on the parking lot itself versus waiting till it gets in the house is even more so. So it's a problem for our streams. It's a problem for our stormwater facilities, but it's a bigger problem for our humans. And then USGS looked at atmospheric contributions from just curing product, because we found that some pretty significant amount of PAHs come off when it's put down in the product versus when it dries. And so where's it going? Well, it's volatilizing, or these are semi-volatile, and they're catching up with airborne sediments, just in a similar way we're talking about sediments being trapped in with waterborne phosphorus. And in that same kind of understanding of exposure, the New York Columbia School of Medicine has done an amazing analysis over 14 years of children, actually women, being exposed while pregnant to airborne PAHs, and the birth outcomes are still with these children even 14 years after they're born. And that's, they backed into basically this calculation that shows that the emissions from coal tar sealed surfaces exceeds on-road auto emissions on an annual basis. That's pretty incredible. Because we go to a whole lot of lengths to talk about airborne emissions from vehicles, which is it's something we should consider, but pavement sealants are on the same order of magnitude, same level, if not more. So what was the result in Austin after we passed a ban? Ultimately, it was after 8 full years, we had a 58% decrease in PAH levels in our sort of our stream, our lake that actually is where most of our streams discharge to. So it was a good read in our streams for sediment, our overall benefits. People oftentimes ask me, what about the EPA? Well, it's not an easy, simple answer. Abel, I saw you on the line. I know it's not one entity, US EPA or any EPA, but they approved coal tar use, reuse in 1993, said as long as it stays put, we're fine. And then yet now we have evidence that it doesn't, and haven't had a chance to relook at that. The other thing is EPA, I'll note that they said in 2011 that the best strategy for a community to address PAH pollution is to pass their own ban, which is kind of an interesting statement. And then I'll jump down to the last bullet where we say that the EPA is participating in a testing protocol development for Sealcoat, and I'll get to that toward my end of my slides. Currently, there's about 25 million U.S. citizens under a outright ban of Sealcoat, and that is subject to change depending on politics of New York, because they passed a ban in their legislature, but it has to be signed by the governor by the end of the year. And we all know that we'll have by next week or so we'll have another governor in New York, and not sure where that'll go. But they can effectively not sign it, and it functions like a veto. And here's your watersheds, and I just superimposed where there are bans in your area. And if you're not aware of that, that's a list, or it shows you on a map where they are, but here's a list from your member agencies. I just highlighted those government units.
Tom, just a heads up.
Yeah.
5-minute warning.
What's that?
5 minute.
Yeah, it's around in the bend here.
Awesome, thank you.
Chesapeake Bay Study is currently underway. It's funded by Chesapeake Bay and others, and as well as the city of Austin. We want to have, there's many different ways to test for Sealcoat, particularly. Do you test it wet or dry, or how long do you dry it? What way do you dry it, etc. Because we need consistent protocols on how to do that as more and more communities are going. It's not just a ban of product, it's actually creating a 0.1% compliance or a 1% compliance PAH standard. So that's, currently underway. I asked about why did Home Depot and Lowe's stop selling it. They said, well, if we've got a product that has high liability and we have a replacement that's acceptable to consumers and costs the same, they just take it off the shelves. So it really only took 2 phone calls to get that done for both of those chains. They already had the system in place to get rid of it. Ashley asked me to address what would it take to get a Sealcoat ban in place. This is my best analogy of what it takes. If you tried to string a bunch of batteries together to get some work done, industry activism is a real thing, and I consider a drain on your batteries. Supporting research, I'm continually surprised by. We got research from all over the place, but it matters. Wisconsin is a great example of that, where really didn't have. Madison passed a ban in 2007, and no real action until USGS joint publication published a study and said, hey, we got a problem in our Milwaukee area streams, and now we've got over 30 bans throughout the area. On the far right, you see sponsor attention. If you don't have political support, you're going to have a hard time getting something done. Citizen discontent on the far left is also an important factor when you have, I know in Wilmette, when they had passed their ban, I think the mayor or president of the council said he'd never had that many calls in his whole career of politics as about the coal tar ban. So all that together, you need all that, plus potentially community circumstances like, do we know it's a problem here? Have we tested? Are they using it at the schools, etc.? For you government officials, there's a free membership I participate in this Asphalt Sealcoat Manufacturers Forum. We have one just private for government officials to discuss how do you enforce a coal tar ban? What are the factors? How do you write one? Just ask questions, etc. It's in its early stages, but you're all welcome to join, and it won't cost you anything. Leave you with this quote. This is from the American Medical Association. They said basically not a good idea to be using coal tar sealants, and they passed a resolution encouraging cessation of its use. And that's it.
All right, thank you, Tom. We got a few minutes for some questions.
I can speak to the ones that are in the chat. So from Thomas Lee, can you visually tell the difference between a coal tar and an asphalt-based sealant immediately or after some wear?
It's a good question. I think if you've got a good nose, actually, you can actually smell the creosote on a warm day on a coal tar sealed surface. We also developed a simple test that you can, using ingredients you get at a hardware store. So if you join that forum or go to Coal Tar Free America or even the City of Austin's website, we've got links to how to do that just with paint thinner. We call it coffee tea test, because one, asphalt looks like coffee, coal tar looks like tea, like a chamomile tea in paint thinner.
A follow-up question was, can you tell the difference between ECR and asphalt-based sealant?
Yes, actually ECR looks like coal tar in that sort of field test we've developed. So it doesn't, basically paint thinner is not strong enough solvent to dissolve it, basically, but it's strong enough to dissolve asphalt.
Any evidence of PAHs in stormwater ponds?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Thank you. That should have paid the person who asked that. Minnesota's got they did a calculation. The state of Minnesota said to clean out their stormwater ponds with all the PAHs in them would cost more than $1 billion. There's currently a lawsuit with some of those suburban communities filing a lawsuit saying, hey, you're causing us to spend more money to clean up these ponds because of the PAHs in the stormwater pond. So anytime, like a rain garden, all the amazing green infrastructure stuff we like to use, they don't go well with Sealcoat, or at least with coal tar. You're kicking the problem downstream, and it will be expensive someday to clean it up.
And Rosemary, you might have to clarify this one, but she said you were going to discuss the recent disclosure bill.
Oh, I didn't. That was a slide. What happened to that slide? Yes, basically, how did I miss that? Huh. Okay, sorry. Well, the disclosure bill essentially is saying that schools need to disclose if you're using high PAH products, or state office buildings need to disclose that. Disclose means let anybody who's going to use that facility know that that's in the planning. And the other aspect of it is that you've got to make an effort to look at non-toxic alternatives.
And was that finally signed by the governor? Is that law now?
Yes,
Illinois?
yes. 2 weeks ago or so.
Thank you.
And I think it's going to be the real challenge with something like that is, will it be enforced? Because or anybody going to pay attention to that? Because you know, it could be easy. People say, I just didn't know, or whatever. And because I find that all the time, where I mean, I contacted a suburban Chicago library recently that was put out a bid for coal tar on their parking lots, and in DuPage, and they said, their community had signed an agreement that they weren't going to use seal coats on any of their facilities anymore. I'm like, but time goes by and people forget. So I think that's probably what the community that knows these things would be helpful, is if you just paid attention. Hey, they're going to seal coat that, or pay attention to see if it's even happening. And this technically, this won't go into effect until January 2023.
We were thinking of contacting at some point the Lake County Superintendent of Education, because they have life safety requirements for the schools and they do check on them. And I was wondering if that would come under the category of life safety requirements.
I would say so, but exactly how that would meld with the state rule, I'm not sure.
No, so we'll have to look into it. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And the last question I see in the chat is, looks like there's two parts to it. So in terms of environment and infrastructure, how much should the coal tar issue be prioritized by the federal government? And then on a scale of urgency, how does it compare to renewable energy?
Wow, that's a good question. I think as far as prioritizing, that's a common question I get, because people say, well, gosh, if we regulate this, or you want us to do that. Well, I think it's, first of all, understanding that the TSCA rewrite, Toxic Substance Control Act of 2016, basically reaffirmed the role of communities to lead the nation in reducing toxics. And so you're just portraying or fulfilling that role. But I think the other aspect of it is that if that risk factor, I mean, we've got a bajillion different chemicals, however many new chemicals we have every year. But if your risk factor, concentration, dose, etc., is similar to what a hazardous waste cleanup facility is, I would do that too. But I would say that's sort of a yardstick to measure what action should be taken. I think regarding renewable energy, to me, I may get in trouble for saying this, but if you don't address an issue that's on where your kids are playing every day, you want to address climate change or whatever that's 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road, to me, that seems to be incongruous. It doesn't mean we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do both, but I would say we need to demonstrate urgent matters. PFAS are another urgent matter, I would say, that need to be examined. So I think we can do all these things. Like a coal tar sealant ban is a relatively easy thing to do. Our enforcement agent at the city of Austin spends, we got one guy for a city of more than 1 million people, and it's a part-time part of his job to enforce that over the whole city. And it just takes a little bit of shrewdness and cleverness on how to do it. And we've only had a dozen or so violations of our ban in 15 years.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time, so I'm going to have to call it there. Thank you, Tom, so much.
All right. Thank you.